Breaking news tonight, an apparent coordinated attack in Boston. A pair of homemade bombs exploded at the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
Terror in Boston. This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
And good evening. Yet again tonight, we're coming on the air to announce another apparent act of terrorism within our shores. And of all places, of all days, this was Patriots' Day in Boston, the running of the Boston Marathon, a holiday in that city. And this happened at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. Here is the view from ground level as recorded by the Boston Globe's website at around the 4:09 finish mark. First, one explosion off to the right. Pedestrians, onlookers between a building and the police line. And then seconds later, less than 20 seconds, a second device detonates. There is bedlam. The race is stopped in midstream. The dead and injured were slowly triaged and transported. Here is the latest based on what we know of the toll. At least 2 people reported dead from today's Boston Marathon. At least 100 people have been treated for injuries thus far at 3 leading Boston area hospitals. Late today, from the briefing room in the West Wing, we heard from President Obama. We don't have the president's comments quite yet.
Single federal resource necessary to care for the victims and counsel the families. And above all, I made clear to them that all Americans stand with the people of Boston.
We did, in fact, have the president's comments from the briefing room. That was within the last half hour. It has been an extraordinary day. Not all initial reports turned out to be true, but the initial fears did. And that was that this was not one but 2 devices apparently placed there to do harm. We have our look at this day so far from NBC's Ann Thompson.
Steps away from their ultimate goal, the unthinkable. Marathon runners and spectators violently injured. 2 explosions going off within seconds of each other at Boston's Copley Square.
At first, it almost sounded like a cannon blast, but it felt so strong, it literally almost blew my hat off. And everybody started running the other way. There were a few people that were running over towards them to help out the injured, and there were some really bad injuries. Some people were very, very badly hurt.
The clock at the finish line read 4 hours, 9 minutes, 43 seconds when the first explosion went off on Boylston Street. The second a block away. A place of celebration instantly transformed into a scene of chaos.
Everything was normal. Everyone was relaxed and happy. Then an explosion right next to the finish line. And then within another, maybe 30 seconds, another explosion. And then pandemonium struck.
Now there was a race of a different kind to rescue people and save them.
I was carrying somebody who lost both of the legs in the explosion. It was a lot of them were lost limbs, catastrophic.
It was loud. It was really, really loud, and people just chaos everywhere.
The smoke could be seen from across the Charles River. Boston police called in all off-duty officers to help. Ambulances took 19 victims to Massachusetts General Hospital.
This is like a bomb explosion that we hear about in the news in Baghdad or Israel or some other tragic space in the world.
And it was carnage. It was just carnage. I actually saw a man who lost part of his leg. And then all the folks from the marathon tent that were treating the runners obviously had to get called into action.
Some 27,000 runners from 96 countries signed up for the 26.2-mile race from Hopkinton to Copley Square. Those still on the course after the explosions were diverted away from the finish line. Authorities would not speculate on whether this was terrorism.
We're not being definitive on this right now, but you can reach your own conclusions based upon what happened.
The race famous for Heartbreak Hill, today the site of just heartbreak.
Tonight, every police agency in the state of Massachusetts is sending help to Boston, as is the federal government. Bostonians are being told to stay indoors, and if they have to go out, to avoid large crowds, while authorities try to figure out who brought to such a violent, deadly end the day that people in Boston, Brian, have always called the very best day.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ann, for that. And about this day in Boston, let's go to Katie Tur, who's made her way up there. Katie, as I understand it, there's 15 blocks that are virtually frozen. As Ann mentioned, people have been told to shelter in place. And once they do go out, avoid crowds, which is pretty tricky on this day, which is a holiday every year.
It's pretty tricky in this area, Brian. This is the Back Bay of Boston. It is a popular area. It is a busy area on a normal day. It is chaotic here during the marathon in a good way because it's celebratory. The bars are open. People are out. Right now, there are people here. They want to see what's going on. I guess they're trying not to congregate. But for the most part, it's pretty quiet for this area. Right after the explosion, there were streams of people walking these streets. The subways were shut down. And because of that, people had to walk for miles in some cases to their destination. In fact, we're 2 blocks away from the finish line, 2 blocks from where those explosions happened. In fact, we saw one woman right over here. Witnesses saw her stumbling to this block with shrapnel wounds. NBC has confirmed that shrapnel was a part of these explosions. That's why there were so many lower limb injuries. Witnesses reported seeing tourniquets being applied on the raceway. Again, Back Bay is usually a very busy area. The streets are closed right now. There are a number of roadblocks throughout the area. There was a ground stop at Logan Airport. We had to circle over Providence for quite a while before they allowed us to land. And of course, Brian, as you would imagine, a very heavy police presence out here. The National Guard is here. And again, people are they're on alert. They want to know what's going on. The police commissioner has asked everybody to stay inside, everybody to go home if they can. And from what you can tell, although there are people out here, most of them have heeded that order, at least around here. Brian.
And Katie, we can see looking at tape of the finish line, the digital seems to say this was the 4:09, 4-hour, 9-minute finishing mark. Again, if you're crossing the finish line at that point in this race, you've done very well to finish it all. You've done very well. But people thought, and you can't blame them for this, that this was some kind of a cannon, some kind of planned thing. And I had one eyewitness today describe it in terms of world trade, that once the second building was hit that day, we knew it was something different. Well, to him, once the secondary explosion went off, they knew it was not an accident of the construction of the city like a gas main.
Certainly, when you're at a marathon, especially up here in Boston, where they haven't had issues like they've had in New York, nobody was expecting something like this to happen. So initially, nobody thought they weren't sure if it wasn't an accident, if it wasn't a gas main break. People didn't know what was going on. But once that second explosion happened about 15 seconds later, people started to believe that there was something fishy going on, something bad. And that's when people started to get a little bit scared, started to run away. A bit of a chaotic scene out here. Brian.
Katie Tur on the streets of Boston tonight, where for a 15-block area, no one's been allowed. We don't know when people will be allowed back in. Katie, thanks. To Washington we go. Our justice correspondent, Pete Williams, has been working this story all day. Pete, what can you tell us tonight?
Well, Brian, tonight authorities confirm that there were 2 bombs. We know that much, but it's unclear how many others were planted. They say there were other suspicious packages. And the word, of course, of another bomb elsewhere placed at the JFK library is apparently turning out not to be true. But at least 5 other packages have been found on the street, have been deemed suspicious, and are being destroyed. But there is no firm confirmation of whether they were actually explosive devices, although some officials tonight say there is reason to think that some of them were. We're told, by the way, that one of the 2 victims that was killed in the explosion was 8 years old. Boston police say there was no specific intelligence warning of any kind of attack, and federal officials tonight say there is no reason to think that this is part of any larger threat. At this point, they believe it is confined to Boston, but a meeting tonight will decide whether any kind of national alert will be sent out. There is no suspect in custody, authorities say, but some people are being questioned, including some with injuries who were taken to Boston hospitals. One of those, a person in whom there is some interest, is a young person who was here on a student visa. Brian?
All right, Pete Williams in our Washington newsroom. We'll be looking for further details from there. Pete, thanks. Michael Leiter is our national security analyst at NBC News. He's the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington. Michael, two things to at least overseas veterans of our dual wars these past 10 years and all those of us who have spent time over there. Number one, the primary explosion, then the secondary explosion as people are running to the first. And number two, the nature of these injuries, an explosive device apparently with added shrapnel, and that kind of haunts everybody involved.
Yes, Brian. The idea of using two explosive devices, the first charge, which attracts to some extent the first responders, the police, fire, medical, and then have a second charge go off that is potentially targeting those responders. It's potentially the sign of a more sophisticated attack. And as you noted, the shrapnel, the idea that there could have been ball bearings or something else in these explosives, clearly specifically trying to kill or maim, not just trying to have a small explosion and get some attraction. It's a sign of a terrorist organization that's trying to kill people.
And Michael, here we are in the post 9/11 era. While it's familiar now to us in a kind of hideous way, it also isn't. We should emphasize that while people, especially in big cities and especially on the East Coast, are going to see precautions at train stations and airports and perhaps big obvious movement of law enforcement, there is no reason to fear that this is at this hour, part of any wider plan, correct?
That's right. People should view the precautions that they're seeing in major cities, Washington, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, merely as precautions. And this is exactly what the federal government and states and cities prepare for in the event of an attack. Heightening basic preparedness, putting more police on the scene. And that is not because they know something specific. It is because everyone wants to make sure that there is a show of force, and should something else arise, that they're in a good position to respond. But it's not the sign of a specific threat necessarily.
Michael Leiter in our Washington bureau. Michael, thank you as always. Cross town we go to the White House. Chuck Todd was standing in the briefing room when the president entered at about 6:10 p.m. tonight to give his remarks on what the White House was comfortable saying so far. Chuck?
Well, I can tell you this, Brian. One of the things the president did not say is he did not call this terrorism. This is, I can tell you from talking to sources, this was discussed and the decision was made not to have the president use that specific word. A national security official does email and says this to clarify, quote, any event with multiple explosive devices, as this appears to be, is clearly an act of terror and will be approached as an act of terror. However, we do not yet know who carried out this attack, and a thorough investigation will have to determine whether it was planned and carried out by a terrorist group, foreign or domestic. So they're being very careful with their language. We know the president's been briefed all day from the FBI director, his Homeland Security director, his own chief terrorism advisor. He himself has been giving briefings to the leadership in Congress. But I can tell you, in talking to officials around here, Brian, there's a little bit of a frustration of how little they do know at this point in time, which is why the president was clearly being very careful with the language he chose to use.
All right, Chuck Todd at the White House. Thanks. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about the nation's need to secure large public events and how that job might have gotten tougher today. We're back tonight. This is the scene as it happened, 2:50 p.m. this afternoon in Boston during the marathon. There's the explosion. One runner hit by shrapnel goes down. But this is an important point here. Between the point of the explosion and the crowd, police, Boston EMS, race volunteers were caught up in it. They were among the targets. So, having seen this, having witnessed this, the question becomes, how can we ever keep our public events safe if someone was allowed to get two devices this close to this classic a day in Boston, Massachusetts? NBC's Tom Costello has been looking at this conundrum for security personnel all day. Tom, good evening.
Hi, Brian. We very often talk about how security changed after 9/11, and it did. But security experts have been dealing with terrorist threats at big gatherings since the Munich Games in 1972. Trying to ensure everyone's safety is a Herculean challenge. For any police agency, planning for high-profile events with big crowds means months of nightmares. But securing and sealing a 26-mile course like the Boston Marathon with 20,000 runners and 500,000 spectators is an almost impossible challenge. Bill Bratton was the Boston Police Commissioner before leading the NYPD and the LAPD.
It is extraordinarily difficult, as you might imagine, that 26-mile route, double that 52 miles because you got two sides of the street. Most of the security would be focused on the finish line area where the actual bombing occurred.
Atlanta, 1996. A backpack holding pipe bombs packed with nails exploded in Olympic Park. 2 died, more than 100 wounded. It wasn't until 2003 that police tracked down domestic terrorist Eric Robert Rudolph.
Can we dress back, please?
London, 2005. A series of coordinated suicide attacks on the subway and bus system left 52 people dead, 700 injured. The attackers used homemade explosives packed into backpacks. Those attacks very much on the minds of the Secret Service when President Obama was sworn in for the first time in 2009. Dan Bongino was the lead Secret Service agent as 1.8 million people packed the National Mall in downtown D.C. A potential terrorist could have been hiding in plain sight.
You can't guarantee anything. All you do in the field of security is reduce the probability of an event like this to hopefully something so minuscule that if something does happen, your response element afterwards is enough to keep the casualties to a minimum.
Times Square, 2010. A car bomb failed to explode and was disarmed before it could hurt anyone. 2 days later, a Pakistani American was arrested trying to board a flight to the Middle East. But big sporting events like the Boston Marathon have been viewed as inviting targets ever since 9/11. The Marine Corps Marathon in Washington attracts 30,000 runners each year. Super Bowl organizers are often criticized for too much security at the big game. And securing every possible public event that could invite an attack is simply beyond reasonable. Michael Leiter was the counterterrorism director under President George W. Bush.
You can't actually protect all of the people at all of these large sporting events or any public gathering. And that's the huge advantage that terrorists actually have, that they can look for the softest, least defended area.
It is not unusual to see in secure zones that all trash bins have been removed, mailboxes removed, even the manhole cover screwed down. But that's the kind of extraordinary security you get when you're in a presidential zone. Putting in place that kind of security at an outdoor marathon, Brian, would really be a whole different matter.
And again, how ironic this happened at what was perhaps the most secure zone in all of Boston along those 26 miles today. Tom Costello from Washington tonight. Tom, thanks. We'll take another break. When we come back, an eyewitness to today's bombing. We are back tonight, this day of the twin bombings at the end of the Boston Marathon. We want to talk now to an eyewitness, someone we spoke to earlier during our developing live coverage. Serdar Azturk was very close to the site of the initial and then the secondary bomb. Serdar, tell us how far you were away, what you remember, what you saw and felt.
I was about half a block away from the scene, and I felt the first one. And I felt it go through my legs, into my chest. I was sitting down, and everyone in the room, everyone outside just stopped moving and instantly had no idea what was happening until that second bomb went off. That second bomb, you felt just as much, you heard just as loud, and everyone instantly knew that it was not what we thought, and it was a bomb. And at that very moment, I walked outside, I looked down the street, and you could see smoke coming. People's faces instantly changed from smiles to tears and fear, and were basically running for their lives. You could look at any direction at any moment at the intersection I was, and there were thousands and thousands of people that you could see in any direction shutting down the street.
And if there was any blessing, Serdar, it was that the medical tent was right there at the conclusion of the race. You had medical professionals and a lot of Boston PD already on the scene.
Yeah, I'm staying at the Fairmont, and the medical tent is right outside our front door. And it was one of the craziest scenes I'd ever seen. Everyone was rushing. No one knew what to do. Most of the people were running away. The the EMS was just running towards the scene. Nobody knew what to do, what was happening. Everyone was just in fear.
Also, the definition of terrorism, it's the last thing you expect at the finish line of the Boston Marathon on Patriots Day in Boston. After a wild day, Serdar Ozturk, thank you very much for helping us report this story. Another break. We're back with more right after this. Marathon Day, Patriots Day, is supposed to be a great day every year in Boston. Instead, this year it turned into a horrible day. NBC's Katie Tur is on the streets of Boston tonight. Katie, what can you tell us there?
Brian, the sun is setting here, and the runners are making their way back home, making their way back to their hotels. Families are reuniting with loved ones, trying to see if everybody is safe, being glad that so many are safe tonight, and also trying to get their head around just what happened and all of the tragedy that unfolded. Again, we are in the Back Bay of Boston. This is a very popular area. After the marathon, right about now, this area would be crowded. It is right now pretty dead. It is very far from normal, Brian, and it will be very far from normal for quite some time.
Katie Tur in Boston tonight. Katie, thanks. That's going to conclude our regular half hour of NBC Nightly News for tonight. If your station is carrying it, we will be right back on the air with a special hour-long edition, a second half hour of the broadcast. If not, it will be available on our website. And an early heads up, we're back on the air tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 on the West Coast, with a primetime special on what has happened in Boston today.
Terror in Boston. This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
That is exactly what it looked like at ground level. The finish line at the Boston Marathon. It was after the top tier of finishers. It was at the 4-hour, 9-minute mark, exactly 2:50 this afternoon, when first one explosion and then a secondary explosion went off. People couldn't imagine what the first one was, but with the second, they suspected it was some sort of attack. And it appears tonight we're coming on the air yet again in this post-9/11 era with word of an apparent terrorist attack within our shores. A terrible day in Boston on what is a holiday in that city. It is Patriots Day. They mark the Lexington and Concord battles. The Red Sox play baseball and they run the Boston Marathon. But tonight, the death toll stands at 2, over 100 injured. We want to go to Jonathan Hall, who reports for our NBC station WHDH-TV. They've been so busy all day long. We've been watching their live coverage and airing it to a national audience. Jonathan, you're at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where they took on some of the injured, correct?
Brian, that's right. Boston area hospitals have been completely inundated with patients. They drill for this. They say they're up to the challenge, up to the task, and they are ready, treating these very seriously injured people. This tragedy knows no bounds. It did not discriminate on the basis of age or gender. Here at Brigham and Women's, we understand that the patients being treated have ranged in age from 3 to 62, both men and women. Dozens of people being treated here. We've seen FBI agents, ATF agents going in and out, Massachusetts State Police. The Boston SWAT team is guarding the entrance to this hospital. It is on lockdown. Nobody in, nobody out, unless they have the proper identification. Of course, relatives of those injured are allowed access to the hospital. So once again, a lot of people here coming in, coming out. We've seen people crying. We've heard the stories as they've come out of the hospital, talking about the blast, what they heard, what they saw, the desperate search for loved ones here in Boston. Brian?
Jonathan Hall, WHDH-TV, having been on the job all day on this terrible day in the recent history of the great city of Boston. Jonathan, thanks. We're now joined by Dr. Ron Walls, Chief of Emergency Services at Brigham and Women's. And Doctor, thank you very much for making time to talk with us tonight. A couple of things I'm struck by watching the coverage today. Number one, how fortunate that if a terrible thing had to happen, it happened adjacent to the medical tent, so triage was fast. They were transported quickly, and Boston is fortunate to have some first-class medical facilities close in and nearby, correct?
Yes, that's right. And we also have worked a lot on drilling these exact kind of events, not just within our level 1 trauma center here at Brigham and Women's, but also citywide. So we've done a lot of work getting ready for something we hoped would never happen.
And sadly, Doctor, two aspects of this we were saying in our first half hour tonight sounded so familiar to us who have been covering combat these past several years, even on a part-time basis. Number one, the notion of a primary and then secondary explosion. And number two, the nature of some of these injuries. I understand you've had some full leg amputations and there are shrapnel wounds.
We had a lot of injuries, particularly to people's legs as they were closer to the blast site. And we also had a fair number of people injured by flying objects. We didn't see any evidence that there were objects built into the device. These were just random flying objects that were sent flying by the explosion of the bomb or bombs.
But Doctor, really, leaving for work this morning on what is a holiday across the city, I am guessing that maybe Brigham and Women's Hospital thought there would be dehydration cases. There would be some after effect of the race. I am guessing it's the last thing you thought. You'd have multiple casualties from a single event in that city.
Yeah, certainly hard to see this coming in any way. And we fortunately have a medical team we deploy near the finish line anyway, just as part of the normal coverage of the event. But we were ready and not ready. We're ready for this because we're ready for this anytime, but we certainly weren't anticipating this today.
Doctor, thank you very much. Dr. Ron Walls, Chief of Emergency Services at the Great Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Mass. Doctor, thank you. Thanks for your day-long work on behalf of all the folks who were brought to your doorstep. To our justice correspondent, we go once again. Pete Williams in our Washington bureau. Pete, it probably bears repeating at this point, while people may be seeing other aspects of security at their local airport, train station, no reason to think this is anything beyond the Boylston Street bombings that we saw in Boston.
That's right, according to all the officials I've talked to tonight, Brian. And of course, they're still trying to figure out precisely what it was that happened in Boston. We know that there were 2 bombs, but they're still saying there might have been others planted along the route of the marathon. Packages found on the street were deemed suspicious and were being destroyed tonight. But we still have not heard any firm confirmation of whether at least the 5 other packages actually were explosive devices, although some officials say there is reason to think they were. There is no suspect in custody, but people are very interested in questioning a young person with a student visa who has burns and was seen by witnesses running from the area. But no suspects are formally in custody. Several officials say the 2 bombs that did go off included shrapnel to multiply the injuries, including BBs and ball bearings. This, unfortunately, is not an innovation and has been used in other terror bombings in the past. Investigators are now studying surveillance video to see if they can see anyone actually placing packages at the points where these bombs went off. They describe the devices as crude, with thankfully less explosive power than might have been contained in packages of this size. Now, strictly as a precaution, security has been stepped up around the White House and at hotels and places where crowds gather in other cities, including some airports. But a Homeland Security official says no directives have been sent suggesting a higher alert. And as we noted earlier, no reason to think that this is anything other than a threat to Boston. Reminiscent of the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta in 1996. This was caused by white supremacist Eric Rudolph. 2 people were killed then, more than 100 hurt. And in that case, there was a device placed to be where a big crowd had gathered. And then 3 years ago, a white supremacist planted a backpack bomb along the parade route for a Martin Luther King Day observance in Spokane, Washington. But it was fortunately discovered before the event and it was safely removed, Brian.
Pete Williams in our Washington bureau. Pete, thanks. And I want to bring in a very proud son of Boston, former Boston Police Commissioner, New York City and Los Angeles, these days a consultant in the security industry, Bill Bratton. And Commissioner, I understand you're over in our London bureau, where today among the subjects you discussed was public event security, i.e. Prime Minister Thatcher's funeral, where you have 2,000 VIPs attending. How are we going to defend and protect our public events when this device goes off within the security cordon, apparently, surrounded by police, EMS, race volunteers at the finish line at your beloved Boston Marathon?
Well, the reality is, as was clearly evident today, is you can't protect everything all the time. You try to prioritize, you try to focus, you try through intelligence to identify, is there a threat? The Boston Police Commissioner at one of the news conferences indicated that there had been no threat received by either his department or, to his knowledge, federal agencies. The fact that Homeland Security is not advising other areas of the country to raise their terrorism level, terrorism concern level, is an indication that to this stage there is no credible threat that has been identified prior to the event of this afternoon in Boston.
Commissioner, what if you were back here? Would it be your guess that they'll have 1, 2, 3 assorted views of this suspect on surveillance video by the time we go to bed U.S. time tonight?
My sense is that what is happening there at this moment is they are attempting to, one, interview as many of those people who were transported to hospitals with injuries. They are trying to, basically, they will certainly be identifying and trying to interview all of the public safety personnel who were assigned to that specific area. They will be attempting to locate and interview people who were in the immediate area who were not injured but who may have seen things going on. They will certainly be looking at whatever cameras are in that area. That area has a bank on the corner, has a number of businesses. So the common practice now is to try to identify what cameras are in that area and to retrieve whatever film they may have. The irony here is 2 hours before this event, that would have been one of the most heavily photographed areas in the world, because there are hundreds of cameras from all over the world to record the finish of the marathon. This event occurred almost 2 hours after the first runner and female runner came across the finish line. So it was fortunate in some respects that the device went off 2 hours after the end of the race, if you will, the front runner. Otherwise, it would have been much larger crowds in that area at that time.
Commissioner, I talked to a woman today who said she was in a restaurant just out of the blast zone. They came in, Boston PD said everybody with a cell phone put it down. Was that because they were worried about an accidental ignition of a bomb? Was that because they were fearful that maybe someone who was setting off the devices was in the restaurant?
You know, Brian, I'm going to have to profess ignorance about that specific set of instructions, whether the concern was by the police officers acting on their own that a device might have been remotely set off with a cell phone, or if there was a concern that cell phone usage might accidentally set off other as yet unexploded devices. You had a report earlier that as many as 5 items had been destroyed by the police as a note of caution because of concern they might have contained explosive devices. But that particular instruction, I can't help you out on exactly what might have prompted that.
All right, Commissioner Bill Bratton, thank you very much for being with us tonight from our London bureau.
Thank you.
Back to the White House we go. Chuck Todd is out on the White House lawn, and Chuck, I've just been told House Speaker Boehner is leading a moment of silence for the Boston victims across town from you on the floor of Congress.
He is, and we now know that we now see that flags are officially being lowered to half-staff. The president himself has been really in information receive mode. He's been getting updates all day when it comes from his FBI director, his Homeland Security director. But of course, it's what the president said and what he didn't say that is important to listen to, including take a listen to what the president said about who could be behind this and what will happen when they figure it out.
We still do not know who did this or why. And people shouldn't jump to conclusions before we have all the facts. But make no mistake, we will get to the bottom of this. And we will find out who did this. We'll find out why they did this. Any responsible individuals, any responsible groups will feel the full weight of justice.
As you heard there, he specifically didn't say the word terrorism. It's something we brought up earlier, and that was a decision they made in advance not to use that term. Down the street, Brian, as you know, the president himself has briefed congressional leaders, and then Speaker Boehner himself led the U.S. Congress in a moment of silence. for those victims in Boston. We're showing you a little bit of that now. So, Brian, all of Washington really a little bit on edge because of a frustration of how little they seem to know, which is unusual for this town.
And Chuck, another illustration of the dark days that can come to the president, whoever happens to be the president at any given time. The last time we saw the president kind of in this cast was days before Christmas, that terribly sad announcement after Newtown.
It was, and he was, you know, it's interesting, the different tone, and you could hear and feel the frustration with the president this time, how much, you know, in that Newtown days, and just how much of a gut punch, and you could see the emotion with the president there. Here you could see and feel and hear the determination and, frankly, the frustration in his voice about the lack of what they know about what happened, who did this, and why. And I can tell you, in talking with various security officials, they're very frustrated. Here they are. They're not used to, even 4 hours after something like this happens, to know as little as they seem to know tonight.
Chuck Todd on the White House North Lawn for us tonight. Chuck, thanks. We'll take a break. Our coverage will continue right after this. We are back tonight with our continuing coverage of this awful thing that has happened on what is usually a joyous and sparkling day in the city of Boston, Mass. And for more on that, we want to talk with veteran sports columnist for the New York Daily News, author and broadcaster Mike Lupica. Mike, you and I spoke earlier, right after the news and right after the import of what had happened here sunk in. For people not familiar with Patriots Day in Boston, with this race as an event, what should they know about what this day should be like?
Brian, people talk about it as a state holiday. Boston on this day, and particularly this area around the finish line, it's like the capital of happy people. The only thing that I've been comparing it to, it's a beautiful spring day that is like Times Square on New Year's Eve in New York City. And what is not supposed to happen is you're not supposed to see people running in terror away from that finish line. This is the day when you make it to that finish line and you are cheered like the biggest winner in the world, whether it's taking you 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours. I just talked, my son's a junior at Boston College, as you know, and his sister, the roommate of his sister ran in this race, and all of a sudden, a lot of these kids carry phones, some to listen to music. She's at about the 23-mile mark today, and her brother is at the finish line across the street from where the first bomb hit, saying, "Stop running, a bomb went off here."
And think about the perversion of that. Think about the fact that half of this race was still snaked through the streets, full stop. Their day is over. All the achievement, all the struggle and challenge that went into this. Think about the fact that most runners arrive in Boston with a support group of 2 or 3 other people, and it's supposed to feel like New Year's Eve in New York, only during the day, and all of that comes to an end.
And just up the street, just up Boylston Street, is the Public Garden and Boston Common, which is the Central Park of Boston. And again, that is always a joyful place on this day, and it became the saddest collection area for families and friends of runners on this day that there's ever been. Brian, there have been times in the past, I can't tell you how many times I've covered this race, and again, it's a celebration not just of the race, but of being alive in Boston. And when you try to make your way from Fenway Park, from that baseball game, back to the finish line, you sometimes feel like you run a marathon yourself, but all you see are smiling people, and now you balance that off against the pictures that you've been showing for the last several hours.
Mike Lupica, thank you so much for being with us. Some great words after an awful day in a great American city. Mike Lupica of the New York Daily News. Back with more of the other news of this day right after this. We're back, and we're going to have more on this situation in Boston in just a moment. First, we wanted to get you caught up on some of the day's other news, including what had been our top story all day until word arrived from Boston. And that, of course, is the situation in North Korea. It remains tense tonight. Still no missile launch from there, though one was widely expected today on what would have been the 101st birthday of the founder of the nation, Kim Il-sung. The current leader, Kim Jong-un, was seen in public today for the first time in 2 weeks, paying respects at the gravesite of his grandfather. Secretary of State John Kerry is back in this country tonight after a whirlwind round of diplomacy in the region, trying, among other things, to pressure China to put pressure on its ally North Korea to back down from its nuclear threats. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez's chosen successor, the interim president, Nicolas Maduro, has been elected that nation's new president. Very narrow win, though, just over 50% of the vote. And in this country, the FAA has ordered more than 1,000, mostly late model Boeing 737s to be examined to see if a part of the plane's tail needs to be replaced. Specifically, it's a pin that holds the horizontal stabilizer, which the pilots use to control the pitch of the aircraft. The potential defect has not caused any accidents. FAA says there's no immediate threat. If that were the case, they say the planes would all be grounded, and nothing close to that is happening. We're back with more of our coverage of today's attack in Boston right after this. We're back, and back up to Boston we go. NBC's Katie Tur was able to make her way up there after first word of this. Katie, it was striking to hear the governor of Massachusetts tell people to stay in their homes, stay off the streets, and avoid crowds. And I imagine the center of that city still feels so eerie.
So eerie, Brian. Every thing that was dropped along the race route right now is being considered suspicious. So they didn't want anybody around potentially dropping anything else or potentially getting in the way. They didn't know if any other devices were out there at this time. People are looking for answers, and right now there are still so few. But what we can tell you is that the Homeland Security chairman has called this terrorism. This was not an accident. It was intentional. It was intended to hurt, and it was intended to scare, he says, and it has done just that. It happened right around the 4-hour mark of the race, intended, it seems, to do as much damage as possible because that's when most people finish the race. The Back Bay right now, Brian, is silent. People are wondering just what is going on. And of course, Brian, they're trying to figure out why anyone would do this.
Katie Tur in Boston, where today was supposed to be just Patriots Day, the kind of statewide holiday, and just known for the running of the Boston Marathon. We're back on the air tonight in prime time, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 on the West Coast. A special report on what happened today in Boston.